October 12, 1944. British airfields across the ocean. Dozens of C-47 transport planes and gliders sat on runways, their engines warming up, preparing for one of the most unusual airborne operations of World War II. Inside the aircraft, British paratroopers from the Second Parachute Brigade checked their equipment one final time. They were about to jump into Greece, a country that had been under brutal German occupation for over 3 years. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were withdrawing from Greece, but no one knew for certain what resistance the paratroopers would face. Would the Germans fight to hold their positions? Would they ambush the landing zones? Or would the British find themselves jumping into a country already abandoned by the enemy? The paratroopers were prepared for the worst, hoping for the best, and about to discover that sometimes liberation missions can be just as dangerous as invasions. This is the story of Operation Manna, the airborne invasion of Greece in October 1944. This is the story of British paratroopers who jumped expecting a fight and found a population desperate for freedom. And this is the story of how the liberation of Greece became one of the most complex and politically charged operations of the entire war. Greece had suffered terribly under German occupation since April 1941. The Nazi invasion had been swift and brutal, overwhelming Greek and Allied forces in just weeks. What followed were 3.5 years of occupation marked by mass executions, starvation, and the systematic plundering of Greek resources. The Greek people had resisted courageously, forming partisan groups that harassed German forces throughout the occupation. But by late 1944, Greece was exhausted, starving, and desperate for liberation. By October 1944, the strategic situation in Europe had changed dramatically. The Allies had liberated France and were pushing toward Germany. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east. The Germans, facing inevitable defeat, began withdrawing from outlying territories to consolidate their defenses. Greece, strategically important earlier in the war, was now a liability. Hitler ordered German forces to withdraw from Greece and redeploy to more critical fronts. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, always thinking strategically about the post-war world, saw an opportunity. If British forces could enter Greece quickly and establish control before the Soviet Union could intervene, Greece might remain in the Western sphere of influence rather than falling under communist control. Churchill ordered an immediate airborne operation to seize key positions in Greece and accept the German surrender. Operation Manna was born. The operation would be led by the British Second Parachute Brigade, veteran airborne troops who had fought in North Africa and Italy. They would jump into Greece along with glider-borne infantry, engineers, and support troops. Their mission was to secure airfields around Athens, establish communications with Greek resistance forces, and prepare for the arrival of follow-on forces by sea. It was a complex operation, with both military and political objectives. On the morning of October 12th, the first wave of aircraft took off from the airfields in Italy, C-47 transport planes. The workhorses of Allied airborne operations filled the skies. Each plane carried 18 to 20 fully equipped paratroopers. Behind them came the gliders, towed by other transport aircraft, carrying heavier equipment, vehicles, and additional troops. It was an impressive aerial armada, and it was heading straight for Greece. The paratroopers sat in the cramped interiors of the C-47s, lost in their own thoughts. Some checked their weapons for the 100th time. Others tried to sleep, knowing they might not get another chance for days. A few joked nervously, trying to break the tension. All of them understood that, in a few hours, they would be jumping into unknown territory, not knowing if they would face German machine guns or Greek cheers. As the transport planes approached the Greek coast, paratroopers stood up and hooked their static lines to the anchor cables running down the center of the aircraft. The jump master positioned himself at the open door, watching for the signal from the cockpit. Below, the Greek countryside spread out in browns and greens. Looking peaceful and deceptively calm, the red light by the door glowed, warning the paratroopers to prepare. Then it switched to green. Go! The jump master slapped the first man on the shoulder, and he disappeared through the door. One after another, the paratroopers shuffled forward and leapt into space. Within seconds, the sky filled with parachutes as hundreds of British soldiers descended toward Greek soil. The moment of maximum vulnerability had arrived. If the Germans were waiting, if they had machine guns positioned to cover the drop zones, the paratroopers would be slaughtered before they hit the ground. But no machine gun fire erupted from the ground. No German artillery opened up on the defenseless paratroopers. The sky remained clear except for the white canopies of the descending soldiers. The paratroopers hit the ground, conducted quick equipment checks, and began moving toward their assembly points. They were ready for a fight that never came. The gliders came in next, released from their tow planes and gliding silently toward designated landing zones. Glider operations were always dangerous. The pilots had one chance to land their fragile wooden aircraft, and any mistake could result in a crash that would kill or injure everyone aboard. But the glider pilots were skilled, and most of the gliders touched down successfully. Troops poured out, unloaded equipment, and prepared defensive positions. Still no Germans appeared. As the British organized their positions and sent out patrols, they began encountering Greek civilians. The Greeks emerged cautiously at first, not sure if these were friend or foe. When they realized the British had arrived to liberate them, the reaction was overwhelming. Greeks who had endured years of occupation, starvation, and terror broke down in tears. They embraced the British soldiers, offered what little food they had, and celebrated their freedom. Patrols pushed out from the landing zones, searching for German forces. They found abandoned German positions, equipment left behind in the hasty withdrawal, and evidence that the Germans had pulled out days earlier. The intelligence reports had been correct. The Germans were gone. Operation Manna, planned as a combat airborne assault, had become a liberation mission. The paratroopers who had steeled themselves for battle found themselves being welcomed as heroes. Engineers immediately went to work clearing mines that the Germans had left behind, and the retreating Germans had booby-trapped buildings, bridges, and roads, turning the infrastructure into deadly traps for anyone who followed British engineers, working with Greek civilians who knew which areas were dangerous, began the slow, careful process of making the area safe. It was tedious, dangerous work, but essential for the follow-on forces that would arrive by sea. Within days, British forces had secured Athens and other key positions across Greece. The Second Parachute Brigade, expecting to fight for every inch of ground, instead found themselves managing a liberation that quickly became complicated. Greece wasn't just freed from German occupation. It was also deeply divided between competing resistance groups, some communist, some royalist, all armed and all with different visions for Greece's future. The Greek resistance had fought heroically during the occupation, tying down German forces and conducting sabotage operations that significantly hindered Axis operations in the Mediterranean. But the resistance wasn't unified. The communist-dominated ELAS and the royalist EDES had spent as much time fighting each other as fighting the Germans. Now, with the Germans gone, these groups turned their full attention to the struggle for control of post-war Greece. British forces found themselves in the middle of what was essentially a Greek civil war. The Communists, who had the largest and best organized resistance force, expected to dominate post-war Greece. The Royalists, supported by the British government, wanted to restore the Greek monarchy. Both sides had weapons, both sides had fighters, and both sides were willing to use force to achieve their goals. The British paratroopers who had jumped into Greece expecting to fight Germans now had to navigate a complex political situation where the real enemies were harder to identify. Churchill, determined to keep Greece in the Western sphere of influence, ordered British forces to support the Royalist faction. This decision would lead to fighting between British troops and communist Greek partisans, a bitter conflict that left many British soldiers confused and demoralized. They had come to liberate Greece, not to take sides in a civil war. But geopolitics trumped sentiment, and British forces found themselves enforcing Churchill's vision for post-war Greece. The airborne invasion footage captured by U.S. War Department cameramen shows the optimism of those first days. Paratroopers checking their chutes before boarding aircraft. Officers briefing their men, transport planes taking off in formation. Gliders being loaded with equipment. Paratroopers jumping into the clear Greek sky. Greek peasants and guerrillas fraternizing with British troops. It all looked like a triumphant liberation, which it was. But it was also the beginning of a much more complicated story. The engineers searching for German mines, the machine gun being set up for defensive positions, the inspection of equipment and supplies. All of this was standard procedure for an airborne operation. But the context was unique. These soldiers weren't preparing to fight an invasion. They were preparing to maintain order in a country that was free from German occupation, but not yet at peace with itself. By the end of October 1944, British forces had secured their objectives in Greece. The airfields were operational. The ports were open. Follow-on forces had arrived by sea and were spreading out across the country. The Germans were completely gone, having withdrawn to the north. Operation Manna, from a purely military standpoint, had been a complete success. But the political consequences of the operation would reverberate for years, and the Greek civil war that followed the liberation would last until 1949 and would cost tens of thousands of lives. It would become one of the first proxy conflicts of the Cold War, with the Western powers supporting the Royalists and the Soviet Union supporting the Communists. The British paratroopers who jumped into Greece in October 1944 had no way of knowing that their liberation mission would lead to years of continued conflict. Today, Operation Manna is remembered as one of the lesser-known airborne operations of World War II. It didn't have the drama of D-Day or Market Garden. It didn't involve heavy fighting or dramatic victories. But it represented something important: the beginning of the post-war struggle for influence in Europe, a struggle that would define international relations for the next 50 years, and the British paratroopers who jumped into Greece in 1944 were liberators. But they were also, whether they knew it or not, the first soldiers in the Cold War.